The night began like any other. I slipped on my jacket, not because I was cold, but because I needed an excuse to leave the house. My room had been too quiet, too heavy with thoughts that refused to settle, so I wandered out into the streets, searching for something I couldn't name. The air smelled faintly of rain even though the pavement was dry, and the orange glow of the streetlights gave the world a muted softness. It wasn't unusual for me to walk like this, circling familiar blocks while replaying conversations in my head, but that night carried a texture I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every sound seemed sharper, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car, the echo of my own footsteps against cracked concrete. Even the silence between sounds felt alive, as though it was holding its breath. I passed the bakery on the corner, its windows dark now but still rich with the scent of sugar that clung to the walls. For some reason, I stopped there longer than usual, staring through the glass at my own faint reflection. My life had been looping, predictable and safe, but there was a restlessness gnawing inside me, begging me to step into something unknown. That restlessness tugged me further down a side street I rarely took. The houses here seemed older, their fences leaning, their gardens wild and half-forgotten. A single porch light flickered weakly, and the shadows stretched strangely across the road. I slowed, sensing that this detour would not be as forgettable as the others. I couldn't have explained why, but I knew turning back wasn't an option anymore. Something was waiting ahead, and I had already chosen to follow it. The side street bent in a way that made it feel hidden from the rest of town. The lamps were spaced too far apart, leaving long pools of darkness between them. My footsteps softened as I reached one of those stretches, and I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear but from the undeniable sensation that I was crossing into a place meant to be discovered only by accident. I noticed details I'd never seen before. A gate half open to a yard overgrown with ivy, a bicycle left rusting against the wall, the faint trace of chalk drawings fading from a sidewalk that no children seemed to claim anymore. Every object seemed like part of a story I hadn't read yet, waiting for me to guess at its missing pages. At the curve of the street, I found something that made me stop entirely. An old bench, weather-worn and bowed in the middle, sat beneath a tree that seemed almost too large for the space it occupied. Its branches stretched wide and heavy, their leaves trembling as though stirred by whispers instead of wind. A scattering of paper scraps lay near the bench, too deliberate to be random litter. I crouched and picked one up. The edges were frayed, but a line of handwriting remained. "Meet me where the light breaks." The ink had bled slightly, as though damp once, but the words were legible enough to send a shiver down my arms. I glanced around, half expecting someone to step forward and claim responsibility, but the street was empty. Just me, the bench, and the tree that loomed like a witness. Pocketing the scrap, I sat down. My weight pressed into the sagging wood, and the night wrapped around me with a strange stillness. Something told me this was only the first sign. I stayed on the bench long enough for the streetlight to click off and on again. That small mechanical blink that always makes you feel like you've just been noticed and approved by something invisible. The scrap of paper warmed in my palm. "Meet me where the light breaks." It sounded like a line from a poem we only half remember, or directions from someone who believes you still know how to read the sky. I looked around for places that could qualify. Corners where shadows splintered, windows where yellow squares spilled across the pavement, the cracked glass of a bus shelter reflecting car headlights into fragments. The phrase wouldn't let me go. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and dimmed the screen to almost nothing. I didn't want its sterile glow to flatten the texture of the night. I opened my notes app and typed the words, then sat there staring at them as if they would rearrange themselves into a map. A breeze lifted the tree's leaves into a glimmering hush. When it settled, I heard it, a faint hum, like an old transformer or a faraway chorus, coming from farther down the curve. I followed the sound. The sidewalk narrowed, pinched by roots muscling up from beneath. Past the leaning fence was a small community garden I'd forgotten existed, beds of soil boxed by timber, a rain barrel, a corkboard with curling notices. A string of solar fairy lights ran from post to post, but only some still worked. They made islands of brightness with soft edges, and between those islands the dark was gentle, respectful. Light was literally breaking into pieces. I stepped closer to the corkboard. Under weathered flyers for lost cats and weekend markets, another scrap of paper had been pinned with a bent thumbtack. The same handwriting, sure this time. If you've found one note, you'll find another. Keep walking. I'm sorry I'm late. The hum deepened, and I realized it came from the power substation behind the garden, fenced and humming like a held breath. Late for what? Late for whom? The question tugged me gently forward, as if the night had taken my sleeve between its fingers and expected me to trust the pace. The path along the garden curled toward the substation fence, where a service light buzzed and threw a trapezoid of brightness across scrubby grass. I wouldn't have called it beautiful, but it had that unintentional grace cities sometimes grant you, an accidental stage where the ordinary steps out and clears its throat. Where the light breaks, I muttered, and felt a little foolish, then a little brave for saying it aloud. There, at the edge of the trapezoid, lay another scrap. This one wasn't a torn corner. It was a full index card, smudged but intact. You don't know me, it read, but I know enough to ask you to trust that this isn't a trick. I need help. The directness startled me. We live in a time when everything asks for attention and almost nothing asks for responsibility. Help implied involvement, and involvement implied change. My life until now had been as carefully arranged as cutlery in a drawer. I'd been good at outlines, at plans, at postponing the part where you admit you want something messy and alive. I looked around. The fence rattled softly as the breeze shifted. Through it, I could see the substation's lattice of metal and the blue-white blink of a tiny status light. Somewhere nearby, a train moaned, a long, tired sound that felt like a line underlining what the card had said. I slipped it beside the first scrap in my pocket and kept walking, noticing how the path dipped toward a drainage channel, how the trees leaned as if they'd learned over time where people tended to go. Another card waited on the low wall near the channel. If you are kind, keep going. If you are curious, keep going. If you are both, please hurry. I laughed once, not unkindly. It was as if whoever wrote these notes had met me halfway between hesitation and momentum and decided to speak to both. I crossed the little footbridge and felt the night change tones, like a record sliding into the next track. Ahead, beyond the last of the garden lights, a longer glow pulled against brick. I couldn't see its source, but the path wanted me there, and I found myself wanting the path to be right. The glow turned out to be a laundromat, open late the way some places commit to being havens whether or not anyone shows up to be saved. Inside, a few machines churned in slow circles, and the smell of detergent drifted out in tired waves. A woman sat behind the counter reading a paperback with a taped spine. She glanced up, then returned to her page with the practiced kindness of someone who lets people come and go without questions. On the glass door, a handwritten sign read, "Change available. Stories welcome." Another card, taped beside the sign, faced outward. "If you've made it this far, you can step inside. Ask for the envelope." My heart thumped once, then settled into a patient drumbeat. It would have been easy to decide this was someone's elaborate joke, to shrug and keep walking, to return to a life whose edges I knew. But the night had been handing me a thread, and I had followed it. To drop it now would be to choose the old orbit on purpose. I pushed the door, and the bell gave a tired jingle. Up close, the woman's book looked like a romance. The cover hero had improbable shoulders. "Evening," she said, and her voice had the softness of late hours. "Need change?" "An envelope," I said, and felt heat rise in my cheeks. "I was told to ask." She studied me for a breath, then ducked under the counter and produced a manila envelope with no name, only a small sticker of a blue star. "This came in 10 minutes ago," she said. "Said someone would know to ask for it." Inside were 3 things: a map of the neighborhood with a path marked in pencil, a key on a plain brass ring, and a final card. "I'm close. Don't be afraid of the door that looks like it shouldn't open." I thanked her, and she nodded like this sort of exchange happened more often than most people would guess. Outside, the cool air folded around me again. I traced the penciled path with my finger. It ended at a narrow lane behind the hardware store, a place I'd passed 1,000 times without ever really seeing. I closed my eyes, pictured the lane, pictured an impossible door, and realized I was already walking toward it, as if my body had decided we were done debating. The lane hid where the map predicted, tucked behind stacked pallets and a mural of a lighthouse that had weathered into gentle blues. Trash bins lined one side like patient elephants. The key felt heavier than it looked, warming against my skin. I slowed when the wall tightened into a bottleneck, where two buildings nearly pressed together. There it was, a metal door, matte and scuffed, with no handle, just a keyhole placed too low, as if installed by someone guessing from memory. It didn't look like it should open. Which meant, apparently, it would. I knelt and fitted the key. It resisted, then surrendered with a click that was almost shy. The door swung inward an inch, and cool, laundry-scented air drifted out. Not soap exactly, but that clean, hollow chill of rooms that knows secrets. I slid inside. The hinges sighed shut behind me. The space was longer than I expected, a corridor softened by old rugs and lit by a line of mismatched lamps. On a small table sat a glass of water, sweating lightly, as if poured minutes before. Beside it, a folded note waited. I unfolded it and saw the writing I already knew. "You came. Thank you. I'm down the hall. If I don't look like someone who should be trusted, trust the feeling that brought you." I walked. The rugs muffled my steps, the lamps cast ovals that overlapped like scales. At the end, another door stood open. Inside, a studio apartment exhaled the perfume of quiet work. Shelves held jars of buttons and bits of wire, spools of thread, coils of copper. Drawings were taped to the wall, schematics mingled with sketches of hands and faces. In the middle sat a young man, hair unruly, eyes gray with the particular exhaustion that belongs to people who keep trying anyway. He stood when he saw me, as if we were both rising to the moment. "Hi," he said. "I'm Theo. I'm late because I almost lost my nerve." He gestured to a small device on the table, no bigger than a paperback, its surface etched with faint lines that looked like a city scene from above. "I made something," he said, "and I think it works, and if it does, it could fix a few small, human things we keep breaking. But I needed someone to reach me first, to prove that the world still answers when you call gently." I glanced from the device to his face and felt the night's thread settle into my hands. I didn't know what this was yet, only that I wasn't ready to let go. Theo watched my eyes travel over the etchings on the device. Up close the lines weren't random. They formed little tributaries and neighborhoods, threaded with small dots like stitch marks. "They're recordings," he said, answering the question I hadn't asked. "Not audio, well, not exactly. I started measuring the way places feel by combining environmental noise, light flicker, and a few social signals we overlook: foot traffic, linger time, how often someone holds a door. I call it a quiet map. It finds the spots where conversation might work better than usual. Where the light breaks, the noise thins, and people soften." I ran a finger near a cluster of dots. "And the notes?" "They were a filter," he said, sheepish but earnest. "I wanted curious kind, not curious cruel. I thought if someone kept following paper breadcrumbs, they'd be the right kind of stranger." He winced, then smiled. "Plus, it bought me time to decide whether I was ridiculous." Ridiculous. The word eased something in me. I told him about the bench, the garden, the laundromat sign offering stories. He listened the way good listeners do, without staging their next sentence behind their eyes. When I finished, he poured water from a covered pitcher into two mismatched glasses. The studio hummed gently, the small refrigerator, the building's veins, the patient electricity of staying up late for a reason. "What does it fix?" I asked. "You said it fixes small, human things." He tapped the device. "It helps people meet each other at the right temperature. We keep colliding cold or overheated, too soon, too late, wrong place, wrong light. I've been testing with a repair group at the laundromat, folks who mend clothes for free on Thursdays. When I route newcomers through the quieter pockets, they stay longer, they talk, they come back. Arguments shrink. Apologies land. It isn't magic. It's placement. Why me? Because the map says you're a hinge, he said softly. Someone who can open rooms without making a sound about it. I need help taking it outside my head. A pilot. Routes, signs, a small event that proves the neighborhood can tune itself. Outside, a train horn folded into the night. Inside, I felt the old drawer of my life slide open and make room for something unfiled. I wasn't sure I believed in quiet maps. I was sure I wanted to see where one might lead by morning. We started with the simplest thing, walking. Theo slipped the device into a canvas sling and handed me a marker and a stack of blank cards. We'll leave real notes this time, he said. No riddles. Just invitations. The corridor's rugs gave way to the soft scrape of the lane, to the mural's weathered blues, to an ordinary night reintroduced as possibility. He moved at an unhurried pace, checking the display where tiny bars rose and fell like a restrained heartbeat. At the community garden the fairy lights were still making their gentle archipelago. Theo stopped at the footbridge. See how people pause here? He said, pointing to a dip in the linger overlay. They're deciding whether to enter a space they think belongs to someone else. If we host a conversation 3 steps after the bridge instead of directly at it, more will cross. We tucked a card into the corkboard, free repair and tea tomorrow, come as you are. We have thread, patience, and good stools. I added a tiny drawing of a mug, surprised by my own certainty. 2 blocks on, we stood beneath the hum of the substation's fence light. Theo grimaced. The sound is too sharp here, he said. But if we round the corner? We did, and the noise softened into a background purr, as if the city had adjusted its coat. We taped a second card at eye level, got a stuck zipper, a loose button, or a story looking for ears. Thursday, 6 to 8, laundromat. I caught myself smoothing the tape like it was a bandage. At the laundromat, the woman behind the counter glanced up and lifted her paperback in greeting. Looks like you found your friend, she said to me, then to Theo. You owe me a chapter for that envelope. He promised one, and she smiled as if that was the currency she preferred. We measured the way air moved between the machines and the folding tables. We shifted 2 chairs by 6 inches. Theo nodded. Sometimes that's all it takes, he murmured. 6 inches, and a person hears themselves better. By the time we looped back to the studio, the stack of cards had thinned. The neighborhood felt lightly braided with invitations. I pictured morning, someone on their way to work reading a note, someone pausing at the bridge and stepping forward. What if no one comes? I asked, not because I believed that, but because the question needed noticing. They will, he said, then corrected himself with a gentler truth. Someone will. The map says one is enough to begin. We set water to boil for tea we were too tired to drink, and I felt the soft click of tomorrow lining up with now, like a key turning where it once refused. I woke earlier than I intended, the kind of early where the world is pale and undecided and your thoughts don't yet have edges. My phone showed a handful of notifications, none urgent, and a weather app promising a clear evening. I made coffee and stood by the window while the steam fogged the glass, thinking about bridges and 6-inch chair shifts and how a neighborhood could be tuned like a guitar that's drifted flat. On the table, Theo's device blinked its tiny status light like a patient heartbeat. It looked unremarkable enough to be ignored by anyone who hadn't followed notes through a garden. Theo texted, tea, thread, good stools, all set. I sent back a thumbs up and added, after a second, I'm glad I kept walking. He answered with a single star, matching the sticker on the envelope. It felt like a small handshake we could carry in our pockets. I set out just after lunch to run a few last errands, pins from the craft shop, lemon biscuits from the bakery that smelled like kindness, a tin of oolong the color of late afternoons. Everywhere I went, the notes we'd left made quiet ripples. At the corkboard, someone had drawn another mug beside mine and written I'll bring ginger snaps. On the substation corner card, a new hand had added is it okay if I just watch? I wrote, always, and tucked the marker behind the notice like a secret spare key. Back at the laundromat, the counterwoman, Ray, I learned, had already cleared the central table and laid out a clean cloth. She had the look of someone who has learned to make warm space on purpose. "You nervous?" she asked. I nodded. "Good," she said. "Nervous keeps us careful." Theo arrived with a box of mismatched mugs. We arranged them in a gentle disorder that looked welcoming rather than staged. He set the device on the shelf behind the folding station and angled it just so. "Not to steer people," he said, catching my glance. "Just to hear how the room is breathing." At 5:30, I opened the door to let the evening in. It smelled like the hour when things are possible. And then, just before 6, the bell jingled and the first stranger stepped through with a sweater draped over one arm. He was 70 if he was a day, tall in the way that makes you wonder who he'd been when the world still asked him to run. The sweater was a fisherman's knit, sleeve unraveling like a sentence that forgot its ending. He lifted it with both hands the way you present a gift. "Could you anchor this?" he asked. "So I can wear it to the pier tomorrow?" He said pier like a promise, and I nodded him toward a stool where the light fell softly. People arrived in twos and pauses. A student with a backpack heavy enough to count as a second person, a nurse with a button jar and a weary smile, a kid of 9 or 10 holding a stuffed dog by one ear, asking if thread could be magic. It could, I told him, sometimes, in the way patience is magic when you let it count as such. Ray poured tea like she was drawing a map of safety, and Theo moved through the room with a listening in his shoulders, shifting a chair, dimming one overhead bulb by a single notch. The hum of the machines became a steady lullaby. Conversation began shyly. Murmurs about stubborn zippers and stubborn days. The student confessed she'd been wearing her coat open all winter because the pull had snapped and replacement had felt like a tomorrow problem that never arrived. The nurse sorted buttons into little constellations. The older man told me about tides as I worked the sweater's cuff back into a patient loop, and I realized he wasn't only talking about water. Half an hour in, the door chimed again, and a shape I recognized stepped through before my mind admitted it. She had a posture I'd memorized once upon a different season, arms crossed not as defense but as habit. Mara. We had been friends in the complicated way that makes strangers think you're siblings and siblings think you're something else. We hadn't spoken since the argument that ended with both of us pretending we were better alone. She spotted me, froze for a fraction, then chose to move closer like a person stepping onto a train she'd almost missed. "I saw the note," she said, eyes mapping the room to avoid mine. She had a jacket in her hands, lining torn near the pocket where you keep small, defenseless things. "It sounded like a place a conversation could survive." The room exhaled. Theo adjusted the mugs as if that could make room for her sentence to land. I threaded a needle, breathed once, then twice, and offered my stool. "Sit," I said. "Let's fix something while we talk." The bell chimed again. We started with the jacket because it was specific, honest work. Cloth forgives in a way people often don't. It accepts a careful seam without asking for reasons. I turned the lining inside out, and showed Mara where the tear had run along a stress point near the pocket's mouth. "It happens here all the time," I said. "We ask small spaces to hold more than they can." She huffed a laugh that had edges, then softened. The murmur around us swelled and faded like a tide in a shallow harbor. The kid with the stuffed dog announced triumphantly that the button we'd given his companion looked like a moon. The older man's cuff accepted its anchor and returned his wrist with quiet dignity. Ray slid ginger snaps onto a plate with the same ceremony she'd bring to a birthday cake. I kept my hands occupied with tiny stitches that felt like sentences you say very slowly so you don't trip. "I wasn't fair," Mara said, not dramatic, not rehearsed. "I translated your quiet into indifference, and then I punished the translation. I kept assuming you could hear what I hadn't said yet," I answered. "And then I was mad you didn't." Theo drifted past us, setting a fresh mug near Mara's elbow without breaking the thread of our conversation. His device blinked, registering linger and tilt, and something else I couldn't name. Placement, I thought. Placement and temperature. We'd collided in the wrong weather last time and declared each other unsafe. Tonight, the air was the right shade of listening. We talked the way people talk when they aren't auditioning for the version of themselves they wish they'd been. Not everything untangled, some knots are meant to hold what they hold. But a few threads released their grip, and the jacket's pocket found its shape again. I pressed the last stitch gently and tied it off. Mara traced the seam with her finger, then placed a coin inside as if christening a small boat. "Do we know how to be friends again?" she asked, half smiling, like someone peeking around a doorway. "I think we know how to try slowly," I said. "Which might be better than what we knew before." Behind us, the student zipped her coat for the first time in months and looked like a person who'd remembered a word she needed at a crucial time. The nurse pocketed 3 spare buttons and a promise to return next week. Theo caught my eye, then tipped his chin toward the door. A new figure hesitated on the threshold, reading the sign as if it might rephrase itself into permission. I stood, feeling the room hold steady around the moment, and lifted a hand in welcome, ready to show them where to sit and how to begin. The newcomer on the threshold was a young woman in a windbreaker the color of storm glass, a reusable shopping bag looped over one shoulder, and worry-riding shotgun on her face. She clutched a skirt with a torn hem and stood like someone rehearsing the right first sentence. I waved her in and Ray, effortless as a tide, slid a stool into a pool of friendly light. "I'm Lena," the woman said, breath hitching. "Interview tomorrow. I don't have time to buy new, and this one's my lucky one." She laid the skirt down as if setting a small ceremony on the table. "Lucky can be repaired," I said. Theo's hand hovered over his device, then retreated. He had learned the trick of being present without being central. We unspooled navy thread and found the rhythm, the up-through, down-through cadence that always steadies a skittish hour. Lena watched, then asked if she could try the last inch. I placed the needle between her fingers, guided once, then let her own patience take the lead. When she tied the knot, she looked at the seam as if a door had opened inside it. Around us the evening found its stride. The kid with the stuffed dog helped the older man fold the sweater. The nurse taught the student how to replace a shank button so it would last. Mara brewed more oolong and, with a private glance, handed me a mug that tasted faintly of mutual apology. Theo shifted a chair again, 6 precise inches. And 2 strangers who had been talking past each other leaned closer, as if a thought had finally found the correct shape. Near 7, a small ripple passed through the room like weather. A man in a city jacket stepped in, not unkind but official. His name tag read G. Patel, Community Services. He took in the signs, the mugs, the low-lit hum. "I saw the notes," he said, "and I was curious what you were doing with a laundromat and a box of thread." "Mostly," Ray said, "keeping fabric out of landfills and people out of their own loneliness." Patel smiled, wrote something on a card from his pocket. "We've been trying to activate quiet spaces," he said. "If you're open to it, I can help you get on the bulletin and maybe a micro-grant for materials." Theo's eyes flicked to mine. Hope and terror are cousins. "We're open," I said, and felt the map inside the device echo with the map inside my chest. When Lena stood to go, she smoothed her skirt once, twice. "I think my lucky thing," she said, "isn't the skirt. It's this room." The bell chimed after her, and the space felt larger, as if we'd borrowed square footage from hesitation and paid it back with use. By 8 the washers idled, their glass portholes reflecting small constellations of lamp and face. We tidied more by tone than by rule, spools nestled into their tray, buttons blinking contentedly from a shallow dish, scraps folded into a neat pile that made future usefulness feel inevitable. Patel stayed to load a jam change machine with quarters and to tell us which forms could be ignored without consequence. "Government translated into human," he said dryly, and Ray saluted with a ginger snap. Mara and I carried the donation box to the back, walking the thin corridor where detergent turns concrete into something like shoreline. "I miss you," she said, simple as water. There was a time I would have armored myself against the softness, but tonight felt correctly weighted. "I missed who I am when you're in the room," I answered. We didn't promise the future, we promised breakfast. That felt braver. Up front, Theo sketched a quick map of the evening, arrows showing flows that worked, A small X where the light had bounced too sharply off chrome, a star over a stool that seemed to catch shy arrivals like a gentle net. "Next week," he said, tapping the paper, "we test an outside node, maybe the bench under the big tree. If the signal holds, we can string gentle pockets between here and the garden." Patel nodded as if this language were already in his toolkit. Closing took longer because people kept inventing reasons to linger. A last biscuit to pocket for a spouse, a question about darning socks, the exchange of phone numbers disguised as the exchange of recipes. When the bell finally stilled, Ray leaned on the counter and let out a breath that sounded like Victory's quieter cousin. "Good trouble," she said. "The best kind." Theo and I walked back to the studio with the empty mug crate swinging between us. The lane felt companioned. Even the mural lighthouse seemed to glow. "When did you know you were onto something?" I asked. "When a woman cried because a stranger held the door," he said. "It wasn't the door, it was the arrangement that allowed caring to be uncomplicated. I thought maybe we could make more of those arrangements on purpose." Inside, he set the device on the work table and connected it to a charger that clicked with relief. "There is a risk," he added, tracing a fingertip over the etched lines. "If this becomes a product, it could get sold to people who want to steer crowds, not tend them." "Then we tend it publicly," I said. "We make the method ordinary and the ownership communal." His shoulders unclenched by a visible degree. We wrote a chalkboard list, thread sizes to replenish, mug hooks to install, a sign to paint that said "Come sit. We'll fix what we can." When we ran out of chalk, we stood at the window and watched the street take itself gently toward night. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a promise with a patient clock. Morning carried the afterglow the way skin holds the warmth of a bath. Messages blinked like friendly beacons. Lena's brief got the job, thank you, the student's photo of a zipped coat with 3 spark emojis, Patel's email with a subject line that read pilot pathway proposal, low lift. I brewed coffee and forwarded everything to Theo with the note, "The neighborhood says good morning." He replied, "Tea at Ray's, then a path walk?" It read like a ritual beginning to choose us. We met at the bench beneath the wide-armed tree. Its leaves shook out a shiver of light, and I thought of the first scrap of paper, and of how instructions sometimes arrive disguised as poetry because that's the only language strong enough to lift a human being one step forward. Theo set the device in the canvas sling. I slotted fresh cards and a stubby marker into my jacket pocket. We traced the route we'd imagined in chalk, bench to bridge to laundromat to the shy corner where the substation's hum turned lullaby, leaving notes where the air felt naturally generous. Ask us about mending. Sit if you want to be found by a good conversation. Bring nothing but yourself. At the garden we met an objection shaped like a man in expensive jogging gear. He frowned at the card, pinched the corner as though testing its dignity. "You're cluttering public space," he said. "It starts with notes and ends with pop-up buskers and food carts, and then we can't move." His voice had that brittle civic virtue that arrives when someone's private friction seeks an official outlet. I felt my chest tighten, old reflex, old ache. Theo didn't argue. He adjusted our distance by a quarter step, then asked the man's name and listened to the answer like it mattered. "Gavin," he repeated, letting the syllables find a gentle shelf in the air. "What would make this feel like care instead of clutter to you?" It wasn't capitulation, it was placement. Gavin blinked, reoriented. "Clear end times," he said finally. "And no tape on the painted posts. And pick up the cards after." "Done," I said, relief and respect braided together. We added 6 to 8 only and tied the note with twine to the unpainted rail. Gavin jogged on, the garden exhaled. I realized then what the device could not measure, the way choosing not to win can keep a space alive. By noon we had stitched a visible kindness between corners. People already sat on the bench as if responding to an invitation they hadn't consciously received. A woman practicing scales on a clarinet used our sign as a music stand. Her notes rose like a staircase and then softened into a laugh when a bee insisted on attending. "Mara texted breakfast tomorrow?" And I smiled at how the word tomorrow had shed its dread. Theo and I stood at the footbridge and watched strangers cross into a room made of air, both of us feeling the gentle tug of what might still be mended next. Patel's proposal moved faster than I'd expected, not because the city suddenly became swift, but because it was small and built from verbs instead of nouns. We weren't launching an initiative. We were offering stools and tea. The document fit on 2 pages and used words like neighbor and Thursday. It asked for thread, a sandwich board, and permission to hang a narrow string of lights from the laundromat's awning. It also suggested we document what changed, not in metrics alone, but in stories, which is another kind of count that bureaucracy keeps forgetting how to trust. Theo and I took turns drafting a paragraph that explained the device without giving away its throat. We wrote that we were studying how placement and gentle light affected comfort, that we were tuning rooms the way one tunes an instrument. We promised to publish a simple how to anyone could copy without us, because guarding a door rarely improves the room behind it. Ray added a line about lint traps and kindness, and somehow that made the whole thing read like a recipe you could actually make on a weeknight. Words slipped through the neighborhood like steam from a bakery vent. A barber offered a chair on rainy nights. A florist donated a bucket of end-of-day stems we could trim into stubborn little bouquets. The woman with the clarinet promised scales soft enough not to hijack conversations. Mara, all practicality wrapped in a grin I remembered from easier years, suggested a sign-out sheet for tools so nothing wandered home by accident. Care needs shelves, she said, and I loved her for that sentence. Not everyone approved. A cafe owner 2 doors down worried we'd siphon his evening trade. If people linger there, they won't sit here, he said, gesturing at tables emptied more by his prices than by our stools. We bought coffee anyway and asked if we could send folks with finished hems his way for a celebratory cup. He didn't smile, exactly, but he stopped frowning long enough to say he'd think about it. At dusk, the sky lowered itself to the same height as the awning, and the string lights switched on with a domestic click. The glow braided itself with the hum of dryers and the rustle of people learning each other's names. I wrote "Tell us what this changed for you" on a stack of cards and left a pen beside them. The first answer arrived in a wobbly hand. I didn't go home sad and then make it everyone else's problem. The second, my zipper works and so, maybe do I. I tucked the cards into a tin and felt the night settle as if it had found its lap. The first time the device failed, it failed kindly. We were halfway through a Thursday when the bars on the tiny display froze and then slid into nonsense. Theo frowned in that inward way of his, the one that never spread anxiety to the people who didn't need it. "Keep pouring tea," he murmured, and lifted the sling off his shoulder. He set the device on a folded towel like a patient, and opened the back with a jeweler's screwdriver that was really a hairpin he pretended was equipment. Inside, the solder line he'd worried about had finally become the truth of itself. "What happens if it doesn't come back?" I asked, knees bent to eye level with the failure. "Then we practice without the instrument," he said. "We know the song now." He smiled at his own metaphor, embarrassed but not enough to take it back. Ray flicked one overhead bulb off, nudged a stool sideways, and the room breathed easier as if proving his point. Placement lived in our wrists now, in the way we turned our shoulders to face a hesitant sentence, in the way we paused before answering so that a person could hear their own words landing. Mara arrived with a box labeled shelf bones and built a narrow unit between the window and the folding table. "For thread, for stories, for the borrowed mug that always returns," she said, bracing a level bubble between lines. She wore the jacket I'd mended, and it moved with her like a reconciled thought. The kid with the stuffed dog, his name was Nico. He told me like a secret, brought us a drawing of the laundromat with the lights like halo beads. He taped it to the news shelf and announced that it needed a star sticker. Ray produced one from somewhere and crowned the drawing without ceremony. Theo resoldered the line and sealed the case. The device blinked back, not triumphant, just present. We did not cheer. We nodded the way you do when a friend returns from a hard thought. A man I didn't know approached with a denim jacket cratered by old cigarette burns. "I stopped," he said. "I'm 2 weeks in and I didn't have anything that fit who I'm trying to be. Can you help me make this one my now jacket?" We set to it with patches and patience. and when we were done the jacket looked like a map of choices that had decided to hold. Later, Theo admitted he'd been terrified the failure would prove that all we had was a trick. Turns out the trick was noticing, I said. He looked at me in a quiet way that registered as an answer. We wrote device hiccup, human steady in the log, and the lights went on teaching the evening how to speak softly. Some weeks began to stack, and with them a pattern I could feel in my bones. Tuesday planning at the bench, Wednesday chalk arrows along the path, Thursday repair and tea, Friday dawn texts from strangers who thought they had nothing to say until they sat on a stool and said it. Patel brought a fold-up sign from a bureaucratic closet and laughed when we covered the municipal logo with a paper heart. The barber hosted a side table for shoe shines that turned into a class on caring for things you'd once assumed were destined to dull. The florist taught us how to coax life from stems that had given up pretending to be perfect. Stories accumulated in the tin like coins and weather. A card from a woman who'd practiced saying no, I can't help with that until it sounded like respect and not refusal. One from a teenager who patched his own hoodie and then asked if we knew any jobs that paid you to listen. A note from Lena, 2 weeks into her new role, describing a supervisor who kept interrupting and how she tried what Ray called the gentle shelf, placing a palm lightly on the table and saying, I'll finish this thought and then I'm all ears. It had worked long enough for her to land her point. Mara and I learned our new shape without naming it too loudly. We kept breakfast dates like people keep watering schedules for plants they hope will thrive. Sometimes we spoke about the fight that had ended us. Sometimes we spoke about nothing and let adjacency do the repair. There is a gratitude that looks like looking away at the right time. We practiced that too. One afternoon the skeptical cafe owner came by carrying a tray of biscuits he called end-of-day experiments. He left them with a shrug that translated to sorry for being a wall. We sent new friends his way, and by the end of the month I noticed his lights stayed on slightly later, the way rooms do when they're starting to believe they might be needed. Theo's chalk maps became a small gallery on the studio wall, arrows and stars and notes about where apologies landed more successfully. He began to write small essays in the margins, chairs placed as though expecting kindness invite kinder conversations. And do not underestimate the moral effect of tea at exactly the temperature of relief. I copied those lines onto cards for the tin. Ray called them instructions for the kind of adults we forgot to become. I stuck one in my pocket like a compass. It was almost inevitable that someone would try to own the thing we were trying to make shareable. The email arrived from a startup with a name that sounded like a whisper trying to sell you a louder whisper. They'd seen Patel's bulletin. They'd heard about our Thursday nights, they'd love to partner, by which they meant absorb, monetize, and optimize the tenderness until it paid rent in their slide deck. They proposed sensors embedded in benches, heat maps at every corner, dynamic pricing for prime compassion zones. The deck was glossy, bright, and wrong in the way a mirror is wrong when you need a window. Theo read it, then read it again, as if a second pass might reveal a small humility we've missed. It didn't. He set the device on the table and said, very gently, If we say yes to this, we say no to the thing that matters. We called a meeting at the laundromat, not to rally, just to tell the truth where the truth had been built. People came because people come when you've offered them stools for weeks. Ray brewed the good tea. Mara arranged the biscuits like galaxies. I explained the offer, the shine of it, the danger curled inside. Patel spoke less as a representative and more as a neighbor with keys to a few brittle doors. We could publish everything, I said. Open designs, open notes, open language. Make it boring to steal because it's already free. A quiet settled that wasn't silence. It was deliberation. The older man with the fisherman's sweater cleared his throat. I've worked on the water, he said. When you catch a thing that feeds you, you don't lock the river. You watch the currents, and you teach your kids where to stand. Nico raised his hand because that's how school had taught him decisions worked. Can we make a book? He asked. That even kids can read? Everyone laughed softly, which is one of the better ways to vote yes. So we did. We spent a week turning chalk maps into diagrams, turning Ray's instincts into sentences, turning Theo's quiet map into a recipe that began with, "Walk your neighborhood and notice where shoulders loosen." We added pictures of stools, a section on biscuits that insisted they could be store-bought, a page called 6 inches that changed things. We printed it on cheap paper and taped a copy to the window with a star sticker. We uploaded a PDF to the bulletin and refused to count downloads. When the startup emailed again, we sent them the link and wrote, "You don't need us to do this. That's the point." Then we returned to the work of Thursday, which is to say, we set the water to boil and put our hands where mending begins. The booklet multiplied in ways we hadn't expected. Someone scanned it and posted it on a neighborhood forum, where it gathered comments like, "Lint, we tried this at our library. We set up 3 stools outside the food bank. We don't have tea, but we had lemonade." Soon we were hearing about tiny repair circles in places we'd never stepped, an abandoned shop front 3 suburbs over, a church basement, even a bus depot during driver breaks. It wasn't a franchise, it wasn't ours, it was simply contagious in the way relief is when you make it visible. Theo watched the ripples with cautious pride. "The danger," he said, "is thinking we invented care." He wrote that in the margin of one of his chalk maps and underlined it twice. "What we did was make it easier to see. And once you see it, you want to keep seeing it." At the laundromat, the Thursday gatherings began to overflow the stools. People leaned against machines, sat on detergent boxes, or perched cross-legged on the floor. Ray adjusted by introducing what she called standing mend, tasks you could do while upright, like knotting bracelets or weaving strips of cloth into mats. It kept the room moving, and no one left because there wasn't a chair. Instead, they carried the room home with them, shoulders looser, pockets full of tiny repairs. Mara and I found a rhythm in this expansion. We weren't trying to name what we were rebuilding, we were simply showing up, side by side, measuring fabric and brewing tea. That became its own definition. Breakfast stretched into walks, and walks into conversations about futures that weren't frightening anymore. "We used to argue about what we weren't," she said one morning. "Now we're just doing what we are." One evening, Lena returned in her storm glass windbreaker, skirt perfectly intact. She carried a friend with her, another job seeker, nervous and hopeful. "I told her this is the kind of room where you remember you belong somewhere," Lena said. Watching her place her friend on a stool felt like watching the first generation of a new tree planting another. The tin of story cards filled faster than Ray's shelves could hold. Patel suggested we digitize them, but I resisted. The cards smelled of ink and biscuit crumbs. They bent and softened in your hands. They were the opposite of glossy decks and dashboards. They were proof that some truths are best stored where fingers can smudge them. Theo soldered a second device, this one steadier, less fragile. He handed it to me without ceremony. "2 hinges are better than 1," he said. "Carry it when I can't." I slipped it into my bag and felt it small, pulsing weight like a secret compass, not pointing north but pointing toward whatever human weather needed a little tuning. The expansion tested us in ways Thursday nights never had. When 3 high school students arrived one week with skateboards under their arms and laughter already spilling out, half the room stiffened. Noise threatened the balance we had carefully tuned. Theo looked at me, then at the device, then back at me. I chose the 6-inch rule. I moved a stool just enough to open a pocket of space near the window, away from the most delicate mending. "You can patch grip tape with cloth strips," I told them, showing how texture and adhesive could marry for a few more weeks of skating. They settled into the offered space, and the hum of machines swallowed their volume until it became part of the room's chorus. Another time, a man arrived drunk enough to make words wobble. He carried jeans shredded in the knees, said he needed them. "Fixed for luck." Ray met my eyes. We didn't turn him away. We placed him by the door where the air was cooler and patched enough to let him believe something had held. When he left, swaying, he said thank you twice, once to me, once to the room. Mara later observed, "Not every visitor is an addition, but even the hard ones prove the structure holds." The startup tried again, this time sending an intern with a clipboard. She asked questions about scaling, about profit models, about licensing. Theo answered by showing her the booklet taped to the window. It's already scaled, he said. Anyone can copy it. That's the model. She left, confused, and we returned to sewing a teddy bear's ear. The device recorded all of this. The fluctuations in linger time, the small pauses before laughter, the way chairs tilted toward or away from tension. But the real record was in the faces leaving with shoulders lower than they'd arrived. I began to notice them on the street during the week. People nodding at each other, stopping at the bench to talk, carrying repaired clothes as if they were carrying proof that small things mattered. One Friday, Patel showed us a draft newsletter from the city. The headline read, "Neighborhood Invents. Repair Nights. Builds community without permission." The article was brief, respectful, almost shy. Without permission made us laugh, but it also made me realize the best things don't always wait for a permit. As we locked up that night, Mara squeezed my hand. "Do you realize we're changing what Thursdays mean?" she asked. I thought of all the evenings I'd once filled with reruns, scrolling, silence. "Yeah," I said. "We've made them into the start of something instead of the end of a week." Theo shouldered the device, Ray pocketed the last biscuit, and the night folded itself around us. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking home alone. I was walking inside a story the whole street was beginning to tell. By the time autumn leaned in with its sharper evenings, the laundromat had become more than a room. It was a pattern stitched into the week, a rhythm you could count on like tides. Strangers began to greet each other in the supermarket, on buses, in queues at the bakery, threads from Thursday weaving into the rest of the fabric. Theo's device hummed along, not dictating, just recording, softer pauses here, livelier exchanges there, the rise and fall of a neighborhood that had remembered its voice. One Thursday, Ray surprised us all with an announcement. "I'm closing the shop an hour earlier every week. I want to mend alongside you, not just serve tea." And so she did, cross-legged on a stool, patching her apron where detergent had worn holes, laughing at the stories she'd half heard from behind the counter. Her presence changed the shape of the room. She was no longer host but co-traveler. Mara began bringing scraps of fabric in bright colors. "No reason repairs have to be invisible," she said, stitching a sunflower patch over a tear in Lena's windbreaker. Soon, repairs became declarations. Patches bloomed like flags, stars, hearts, constellations, simple squares in mismatched hues. People left not only mended but marked, walking testaments that damage could turn into design. The story cards in the tin grew more poetic. "I came for a button, I left with a friend. My jacket wears its scars as lanterns. I forgot what kindness in a chair feels like until tonight." Reading them at the end of each session felt like listening to the city speak back. Theo and I began mapping beyond the immediate path. "What if the bench outside the library became a node?" he asked. "What if the empty kiosk by the bus stop could hold 2 stools and a thermos?" He drew new diagrams, cautious but hopeful. The risk of growing too wide was losing the tenderness that made the core strong. Still, the thought of scattering gentle spaces across town made my pulse quicken with possibility. Late one evening, as we folded the cloths and stacked the mugs, Theo looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. "When I started this, I thought the device was the invention. But it's not." "What is?" I asked. "The invention," he said, "is permission. We're just reminding people they had it all along." I carried those words home like a key in my pocket, feeling them click softly against every locked door I had once believed was permanent. The city's interest grew in proportion to its confusion. Patel forwarded us meeting invites with subject lines like scalable community engagement model and leveraging informal networks. We attended one, sitting at the end of a long table under fluorescent lights that flattened everything. Officials asked about outcomes, about impact reports, about replicability. Theo slid the booklet across the table and said, "You replicate it by doing it. That's the whole manual." Blank stares answered him. I added, "We're not hiding data. We're just saying the most important metric is whether people come back on their own." One official leaned forward, pen poised. "And why do they?" Ray, who had come despite her dislike of boardrooms, answered with a smile sharp enough to cut the air. Because someone saves them a seat. That silenced the room longer than statistics ever could. Back at the laundromat, we laughed the stiffness off. Let them make charts, Mara said. We'll make biscuits. And we did, trays of them cooling beside folded shirts. The students who once brought skateboards now brought friends. Nico started a notebook where he sketched every repaired item like a catalog of resilience. Lena organized a clothes swap corner. Patel, still half bureaucrat, half neighbor, began calling Thursdays his fieldwork. One night, a woman arrived carrying nothing but silence. She sat, hands folded, eyes down. We didn't ask her name. We offered tea, a thread to hold, a stool angled so she was part of the circle without needing to speak. She stayed for the whole session, left with a quiet nod. The following week she returned with a shirt whose buttons had been missing so long she'd forgotten what closure felt like. Together we sewed them back, each stitch a tiny reclaiming. When she buttoned the shirt at the end, the room clapped softly, and she smiled with a radiance that made the string lights seem like dim understudies. The device blinked steadily through all this, collecting its maps of human warmth, but more often I forgot it was there. I realized that was its highest success. It had faded into the background, a silent accompanist while the real music played in hands and words and mugs passed around. That night, as I locked the door, Theo lingered beside the mural lighthouse, now touched up by a local artist so it glowed fresh against the brick. You know, he said, if this all ended tomorrow, it would still have worked. I shook my head. No. If it ended tomorrow, it would still be working. In the patches, in the cards, in the way people walk down the street now. We stood there in the cool night, the city humming around us, both of us knowing the truth. Some inventions outlive their inventors because they lodge themselves in the habits of strangers. And strangers, once softened, rarely forget the way back. In the end, it wasn't about notes, devices, or even the laundromat. It was about remembering that people can still stitch one another back together with presence, patience, and 6 inches of space in the right direction. The city will keep humming, lives will keep fraying at their edges. But now there are places where mending feels possible. As I walk home beneath the same streetlights that once made me restless, I slip my hand into my pocket and touch the old scraps of paper I've kept. Their words have faded, but the invitation remains: keep going, keep trusting, keep helping. And I know I will.